It was a quiet Monday morning in the small town of Maplewood, a place where life moved at a steady, predictable pace. For Judge Helen Carter, it was just another day in the courtroom, overseeing cases that, more often than not, were routine. Maplewood wasn't known for much crime, and most of the cases were petty offenses, disputes over property, minor theft, or traffic violations. Helen had been a judge for nearly 20 years, and after the tragedy of losing her daughter Emily 12 years ago, her work had become her life. It was the one place where she felt in control, where her emotions didn't betray her, and where she could bury herself in the mundane details of the law, distracting herself from the gaping hole in her heart. That morning was no different. Helen entered the courtroom, her face calm and composed, the embodiment of professionalism. She was respected by her peers and admired by the community. She had earned a reputation for being tough but fair, a judge who always sought justice with integrity. She was the kind of person who gave second chances when they were deserved, but handed down firm sentences when justice demanded it. Today's docket was full, but none of the cases seemed out of the ordinary, until the last one. As Helen sat on the bench, calling case after case, she had no idea that the final defendant would change her life forever. "Next case, Mark Thompson," the clerk announced. Helen looked down at the file. Mark Thompson, 37 years old, charged with theft and burglary. A repeat offender, nothing unusual for someone like him. He'd been in and out of the system for most of his adult life. Petty crime after petty crime. She barely glanced at him as he shuffled into the defendant's box, escorted by a pair of guards. His eyes were downcast, his shoulders hunched, as if he knew this was just another step in a life that had gone nowhere. But something was different. As Helen began to read through the charges, she happened to glance up at Mark for a brief moment, and then her heart stopped. There, around his neck, was a necklace she had seen before. Not just any necklace, but the necklace, the one she had given to Emily on her 16th birthday, a delicate gold chain with a small heart-shaped locket. It was unmistakable. Helen's breath caught in her throat, her vision blurred for a moment, and she blinked, trying to focus. Surely it couldn't be the same one. But no matter how hard she tried to convince herself otherwise, she knew, deep down, it was the same necklace. The same one her daughter had worn the day she disappeared. Suddenly, the air in the courtroom felt thick, suffocating. Helen's heartbeat pounded in her ears as she stared at the necklace, her mind racing back to the day Emily vanished without a trace. That day was forever burned into her memory, every detail etched in painful clarity. It had been an ordinary summer afternoon. Emily had told her she was going to meet friends in town, and she had never come back. No note, no signs of struggle, no clues, just gone. The search had been exhaustive. The town had rallied around the Carter family. But after months of no leads, the case went cold. Every parent's worst nightmare had become Helen's reality, and it had consumed her ever since. For years, she had hoped for some sign, some clue that would tell her what happened to her daughter. But there had been nothing. Until now. Now, in the most unlikely of places, here in her own courtroom, was a man wearing Emily's necklace. Helen's hand trembled as she held the file. Her vision blurred again, but this time she couldn't control it. The shock was too much. She tried to steady her breathing, but her chest tightened with panic. Questions swirled in her mind. How did he get the necklace? Could it really be Emily's? Was she still alive? And if so, why had she never come home? Her body betrayed her before her mind could process it fully. The room began to spin, and the walls seemed to close in around her. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her chest, suffocating her. The last thing she remembered was the sound of her gavel hitting the bench before her legs gave out. The courtroom erupted in chaos. Gasps echoed off the walls, and people rushed to her side. The guards quickly grabbed Mark and escorted him back into custody, unaware of what had just transpired. Helen's colleagues hurried to her, calling her name, but she was unconscious. It wasn't just a physical collapse. It was as though her entire world had fallen apart again in a single moment. The pain and grief she had buried for so long had resurfaced with a force so powerful it had knocked her down. She was rushed to the hospital, the doctors running tests, checking her vitals. Physically, she would be fine, they said. Just a fainting spell caused by stress, perhaps, but they had no idea of the emotional turmoil that had caused it. No one could have guessed the storm that was raging inside her mind, nor the tidal wave of memories that had washed over her when she saw that necklace. In the hours that followed, as Helen lay in the hospital bed, her mind was anything but calm. Every image of Emily's face flashed before her, every moment she had spent searching, every lead that had turned up nothing. The necklace was more than a piece of jewelry. It was a symbol of everything she had lost, of all the unanswered questions that had haunted her for over a decade. Later that night, as she stared at the ceiling, she made a decision. She couldn't let this go. She couldn't just dismiss it as a coincidence. That necklace had belonged to Emily. There was no doubt in her mind. And now, she had to find out how it had ended up in Mark Thompson's possession. She needed answers, and she would stop at nothing to get them. Even if it meant crossing the line she had sworn to uphold, even if it meant unraveling the life she had carefully pieced back together, she had to know. The next morning, when Helen was discharged from the hospital, she returned home, but she didn't rest. Instead, she sat at her kitchen table, staring at a photograph of Emily wearing the necklace. She traced the outline of the locket in the photo with her finger, the same way she had done 1,000 times before. But this time was different. This time, she wasn't just grieving. She was planning. Whatever it took, she would find out where that necklace had been, and more importantly, where her daughter was. Helen had always believed in the law, in the system she served, but now she faced a dilemma she never thought she'd encounter. She couldn't be impartial, not in this case, not when it involved her own flesh and blood. But could she really step outside her role as a judge? Could she follow her instincts as a mother without breaking the ethical code she had lived by for so long? As she sat in the quiet of her home, Helen knew this was the beginning of a journey that could destroy everything she had built. Her career, her reputation, and perhaps even the fragile hope she held onto that Emily was still out there somewhere. But none of that mattered anymore. The only thing that mattered was finding the truth. And so, with her decision made, Helen picked up the phone and made the first of many calls that would set her on a collision course with her past. The necklace was the key, and Mark Thompson held the answers. Whether he knew it or not, he had opened a door to a dark secret that had been buried for far too long. Helen had always been a woman of principles. She had built her life on a foundation of rules, structure, and the unwavering belief that justice, when properly applied, would prevail. For years, she had sat in judgment of others, listening to their stories, weighing their fates. She had learned to compartmentalize her emotions, to never let her personal life seep into her professional decisions. But after what happened in the courtroom, her carefully constructed walls began to crumble. The necklace, the one thing that had tied her to her daughter in the years since Emily disappeared, had reappeared on the neck of a man she had never met. A petty criminal who, by all accounts, should have been nothing more than another case on her docket. Yet that simple piece of jewelry had thrown her life into chaos. The more she thought about it, the more questions haunted her, and she knew there was no way forward without answers. Helen spent hours poring over every detail of Mark Thompson's criminal record. It was late into the night, and her usually organized and methodical approach was now replaced by a frenetic energy. She couldn't focus on anything else. Her desk was covered in court documents, files, and case histories, most of which were completely unrelated to her current obsession. She hadn't slept since she'd left the hospital, and though she knew exhaustion was creeping in, she couldn't stop. Mark Thompson's life, at first glance, seemed like the typical downward spiral of a man who'd never caught a break. He'd grown up in a series of foster homes, in and out of trouble since his early teens. Petty theft, vandalism, assault. There was nothing in his record to suggest he was involved in anything more sinister than trying to survive on the fringes of society. But the necklace, It was a connection she couldn't ignore. It was the one piece of evidence that made him different from any other criminal she had ever sentenced. Sitting in her darkened living room, lit only by the dim glow of her laptop screen, Helen replayed the events of the day in her mind. The way Mark had shifted uncomfortably in his seat during the hearing. The way his eyes had darted away from her whenever she looked at him. At the time, she had written it off as nervousness, the typical response of someone standing before a judge. But now, with her newfound knowledge, every moment of the trial seemed loaded with meaning. Could he have known who she was? Could he have recognized her? She decided it was time to confront Mark again, but this time, she couldn't do it as Judge Carter. She had to find a way to talk to him without the weight of the courtroom hanging over them both. Helen needed him to open up, to reveal where he had gotten the necklace, and most importantly, how it had come to be in his possession. The next morning, she called her most trusted colleague, Detective Sam Mitchell, an old friend who had been with the Maplewood Police Department for as long as she had been on the bench. Sam had been the lead investigator on Emily's case all those years ago, and although he had never found a solid lead, he had never stopped caring about the outcome. They shared a bond forged in the fire of that tragedy, and Helen knew if anyone could help her, it would be him. When Sam arrived at her house later that afternoon, his expression was one of concern. He hadn't seen Helen in this state since the early days of Emily's disappearance, and it worried him. "Helen, you've been through so much," he began, his voice steady but laced with empathy. "Are you sure you're up for this?" "I don't have a choice," Helen replied, her voice firmer than she expected. "That necklace, there's no way it's a coincidence. It's Emily's. I need to know how he got it." Sam sighed and took a seat across from her. "You're asking for a lot of trouble. You know that, right? If you go down this road, it's going to get messy. Mark Thompson's not exactly the kind of guy who's going to tell you the truth just because you ask nicely. I don't care how messy it gets, Dan. I need to know. I've lived in this purgatory for 12 years. I can't go on like this, not when there's finally a lead, no matter how small it is." Sam leaned back in his chair, studying her face. He could see the determination in her eyes, the same fierce resolve that had made her a force to be reckoned with in the courtroom. "All right," he said at last. "But we need to be smart about this. We can't just haul him in for questioning about something that isn't related to his current charges. We need a reason." "I'll give you one," Helen said, her mind already racing with possibilities. "Reopen Emily's case. Officially." Sam hesitated. "Helen, that case went cold a long time ago. We've got nothing to go on." "We do now," she insisted. "The necklace is evidence. If you can connect it to Emily, that gives us a reason to bring him in for questioning." Sam ran a hand through his thinning hair and nodded slowly. "Okay, but we have to tread carefully. You know the rules better than anyone. If this blows up, it could end your career." Helen didn't flinch. "I don't care about my career anymore, Sam. I just want the truth." The next day, Sam arranged for Mark to be brought in for questioning under the pretext of needing to gather more information about his recent burglary charges. Helen sat in an observation room, watching through the one-way glass as Mark was escorted into the small interrogation room. He looked nervous, his eyes shifting around the room as if searching for a way out. He hadn't been told why he was there, and Helen could sense his anxiety growing. Sam entered the room, casual but authoritative. "Mark," he began, taking the seat across from him, "we've got some questions about your recent activities. We want to clear up a few things about the necklace you were wearing during your court appearance." Mark's eyes flicked up, startled. "The necklace," he repeated, his voice rough. "What about it?" "We're interested in where you got it," Sam said, his tone even. "It's not something you typically see on someone in your position. Looks valuable. Sentimental. Even." Mark shifted in his seat. "I don't remember exactly. I buy a lot of stuff off people, you know. Sometimes you just pick things up on the street." "Is that right?" Sam asked, his eyes narrowing. "You're sure you don't remember where it came from?" There was a long pause, and Mark swallowed hard. Look, I don't know. Okay. It's just a necklace. Why does it matter? Helen, watching from the other side of the glass, felt her chest tighten. He was lying. She could see it in the way he avoided eye contact, in the way his hands fidgeted with the edge of his shirt. He knew more than he was letting on. Sam leaned forward slightly, his voice lowering. Mark, here's the thing. That necklace belonged to someone important, someone who's been missing for a long time. And if you're connected to that, it could mean serious trouble for you. So I'm going to ask you again, where did you get it? Mark's face went pale. His eyes darted around the room, as though searching for an escape. I told you. I don't remember. It was a long time ago, all right. I just bought it off some guy on the street. Sam didn't press further, at least not yet. He knew better than to push too hard too soon. All right, Mark, he said, standing up. We'll be in touch. As the guards came to take Mark back to his cell, Helen felt a wave of frustration wash over her. They were so close, but still so far from the truth. Mark knew more than he was saying, but getting him to talk was going to be a challenge. She would have to find another way to break him, to make him reveal the truth. Later that night, Helen sat alone in her living room once again, staring at the photograph of Emily on the mantel. The necklace sparkled in the picture, a haunting reminder of everything she had lost. She knew this was only the beginning, that finding out the truth would take time and sacrifice. But she was prepared for whatever came next. For now, all she had was the necklace and the slim hope that it would lead her to Emily. But as Helen sat there, a deep sense of unease crept over her. Something told her that the necklace was only the tip of the iceberg, and that the truth, when it finally came to light, would be far darker and more devastating than she had ever imagined. Helen couldn't shake the feeling that her world was slowly unraveling. Every time she thought she had a lead, the answers seemed to slip through her fingers. The necklace had brought her closer to the truth, but it also opened up a chasm of uncertainty that she wasn't sure how to navigate. The following days were a blur as she tried to carry on with her duties in the courtroom. But every time she sat behind the bench, her mind was elsewhere. She would catch herself staring off into space, replaying the interrogation of Mark Thompson, thinking about his every word, his every movement, trying to decipher what he was hiding. Her colleagues noticed the change in her demeanor. They whispered in the hallways, sharing concerned looks as Helen moved through the courthouse like a ghost. She was always so composed, so steady. But now, something was clearly wrong. She didn't care about the gossip, though. All she cared about was finding the truth. The rest of the world could fall away, for all she cared, as long as she could figure out what had happened to Emily. One evening, after a particularly long and frustrating day in court, Helen returned home to find a letter waiting for her on the front porch. There was no return address, just her name scrawled on the front in a shaky hand. Her heart quickened as she picked it up, her mind immediately jumping to the possibility that it might be connected to Emily. She opened the envelope with trembling fingers and unfolded the piece of paper inside. The message was short, written in the same shaky handwriting. Stop looking. This won't end well for you. Helen's breath caught in her throat as she read the words over and over again. It was a threat, plain and simple. Someone didn't want her digging into Mark Thompson or the necklace. But who? And why? The threat didn't scare her. It only fueled her determination. Whoever had sent the letter clearly knew something. They were trying to keep her from uncovering the truth, and that meant she was on the right track. The next morning, Helen called Sam and told him about the letter. He arrived at her house within the hour, looking more serious than she had ever seen him. You need to be careful, Helen, he said as he examined the letter. This is more than just a threat. Someone's watching you, and they're willing to take steps to keep you quiet. I don't care, Helen said, her voice steady. I'm not going to stop. Not until I know what happened to Emily. Sam sighed and ran a hand through his hair. I know you won't, but we need to be smart about this. Whoever sent this letter, they're trying to intimidate you. And if you keep pushing, they might do more than just send threats." Helen didn't respond. She had already made up her mind. She wasn't going to back down. Not now. Not after everything she had been through. Emily was her daughter, and if there was even the slightest chance that she was still alive, Helen would move heaven and earth to find her. Over the next few days, Helen threw herself into the investigation with a renewed sense of purpose. She and Sam worked together, quietly reopening Emily's case without drawing too much attention. They scoured old files, re-interviewed witnesses, and looked for any connection between Mark Thompson and the people who had been in Emily's life before she disappeared. They even tracked down the original street vendors who might have sold the necklace, though none of them remembered anything specific about it. It wasn't long before they hit another roadblock. No one seemed to know where the necklace had come from, and every lead they followed turned out to be a dead end. Helen's frustration grew with each passing day, but she refused to give up. She knew there was something they were missing, something crucial that would unlock the truth. One afternoon, as she was reviewing old case files in her office, Helen received a call from Sam. His voice was tense, urgent. "Helen, you need to get down here. Now." Her heart raced as she grabbed her coat and hurried to the police station. When she arrived, Sam was waiting for her in his office, a grim expression on his face. "We've found something," he said, motioning for her to sit down. Helen sat, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. "What is it?" Sam leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. "We've been looking into Mark's background, trying to figure out how he could be connected to Emily's disappearance. Turns out, Mark wasn't just a petty thief. He was involved with a group, an underground trafficking ring that was operating in the area around the time Emily went missing." Helen felt the blood drain from her face. Trafficking? It couldn't be. Her mind raced as she tried to process the information. "Are you saying that Mark was involved in human trafficking?" Sam nodded grimly. "It looks that way. We don't know the full extent of his involvement yet, but it's possible that he crossed paths with Emily, or worse, that she was taken by the same people he was working with." Helen's stomach churned. The thought of her daughter being caught up in something so dark, so horrifying, was almost too much to bear. But it also made sense. If Emily had been taken by traffickers, it would explain why she had never been found, why there had been no trace of her for all these years. "I don't understand," Helen said, her voice shaky. "Why would Mark have the necklace? If he was involved with these people, wouldn't he try to keep a low profile? Why wear something so obvious?" Sam shook his head. "We're still trying to figure that out. It's possible he took it as some kind of trophy, or maybe he didn't even realize its significance. But we're starting to piece together a bigger picture here, and it's not looking good." Helen leaned back in her chair, her mind spinning. Trafficking. It was worse than she had imagined. And yet, in some strange way, it was also a lead, a new direction to follow. If Mark was involved in this ring, then someone else in the organization might know what happened to Emily. It was a slim chance, but it was more than she had before. As Helen sat there, absorbing the weight of what she had just learned, Sam reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a folder. "There's something else," he said, sliding the folder across the desk toward her. Helen opened it, her eyes scanning the contents. It was a series of photographs, old surveillance images from a few years ago. In one of them, she saw a man she didn't recognize, standing next to Mark. He was tall, with dark hair and a sharp jawline. Something about him seemed off, though she couldn't quite put her finger on it. "That's John Harper," Sam said quietly. "He's a local businessman, owns half the real estate in town, but we've been watching him for a while now. We think he's connected to the trafficking ring, and to Mark." Helen's eyes widened as she stared at the photo. She had heard of John Harper before. He was one of Maplewood's most prominent citizens, known for his charitable work and his influence in the local government. He was a pillar of the community, someone everyone trusted. The idea that he could be involved in something so heinous was almost unthinkable. "We don't have enough evidence to arrest him yet," Sam continued. But we're getting close. If Harper is involved, he could be the key to finding out what happened to Emily. But we need to be careful. He's powerful, and if he knows we're onto him, he could disappear." Sam sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "All right, but we do this my way. We're not going to let you walk into a lion's den unprepared. If Harper is connected to the trafficking ring, then he's not just going to give you the answers you want. We'll need to be smart about this." Helen nodded, knowing Sam was right. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about justice. It was about the truth. And it was about Emily. As she left Sam's office that day, Helen knew the stakes had never been higher. She was about to go up against a man who had the power to destroy everything she had built, and possibly even her life. But she didn't care. She had come too far to turn back now. The truth was out there, and she would stop at nothing to find it. The weight of Helen's decision to confront John Harper hung over her like a thick, oppressive cloud. For days, she had been wrestling with the moral and ethical implications of her actions. She was a judge, a person sworn to uphold the law. But now she was stepping dangerously close to the edge of that very law. Confronting a man like Harper outside of the formal justice system was risky, both for her career and her safety. But the potential reward, the possibility of finding out what had happened to Emily, was too great for her to ignore. Helen knew that if she crossed this line, there would be no going back. Every fiber of her being told her that Harper was involved in something dark, something far bigger than anyone in their quiet town could imagine. She couldn't ignore the signs anymore. The photographs Sam had shown her, the connection between Mark Thompson and the trafficking ring, the anonymous letter warning her to stop. It all pointed to Harper. He was at the center of it, like a spider sitting at the center of a vast web of corruption. In the days leading up to their meeting, Helen prepared herself mentally for what was to come. She knew she needed to approach Harper carefully, to keep her emotions in check, to not tip her hand too soon. She couldn't afford to show him her cards before she had a better understanding of the game he was playing. But at the same time, Helen knew she was running out of time. The pressure was building, and if she didn't act soon, she feared the truth would slip through her fingers once again. One evening, as the sun was setting over Maplewood, Helen decided it was time. She had arranged for a meeting with Harper under the guise of discussing a charitable event he was hosting, a local fundraiser for underprivileged children, something that had earned him praise from the community. It was the perfect cover. Harper would have no reason to suspect that the real reason she wanted to meet with him had nothing to do with charity and everything to do with his dark, hidden life. They agreed to meet at a local cafe, one of the fancier places in town where the upper echelons of Maplewood society often gathered. It was an open, public space, and Helen thought it would be safer to confront him there. If anything went wrong, at least there would be people around. When Helen arrived, Harper was already seated at a table by the window. He looked every bit the successful businessman, dressed in a tailored suit, his dark hair slicked back, a charming smile plastered on his face as he chatted with one of the cafe staff. To anyone else, he would seem like a model citizen, a pillar of the community. But Helen saw through the facade. She knew there was something far more sinister lurking beneath the surface. "Judge Carter," Harper greeted her warmly as she approached the table. "It's so good to see you again. Please, sit down." Helen forced a polite smile and took a seat across from him. She had to play the part for now. "Thank you, John. I appreciate you taking the time to meet with me." "Of course," Harper said smoothly, leaning back in his chair. "Anything for one of Maplewood's finest. I've always admired your work, you know. You have a real sense of justice. It's what this town needs." Helen nodded, the words feeling hollow. She had no interest in pleasantries, but she knew she had to ease into the conversation carefully. "Thank you. I've always tried to do what's right for the community." Harper smiled again, but this time there was something calculating in his eyes. "And what can I do for you, Judge? I assume this meeting isn't just about our little charity event." Helen's heart raced, but she kept her expression calm. "You're right," she said, her voice steady. "There's something else I wanted to talk to you about. Something that's been bothering me." "Oh." Harper raised an eyebrow, his tone light, but his interest clearly piqued. "Do tell." Helen took a deep breath, choosing her words carefully. "I've been looking into a few cases recently, cases involving people you might know. Mark Thompson, for instance." For a split second, she saw a flicker of something in Harper's eyes, surprise, maybe even recognition, but it was gone as quickly as it had appeared. He leaned forward slightly, his expression curious. "Mark Thompson. I can't say the name rings a bell. What does this have to do with me?" Helen wasn't buying his act. She knew he was lying, but she needed to draw him out, to make him slip. "Thompson has been connected to some illegal activity in the area," she said, watching his reaction closely. "Specifically, a human trafficking ring." Harper's expression didn't change, but there was a subtle shift in the air around them. His smile remained, but it no longer reached his eyes. "That's quite a serious accusation, Judge. I hope you're not implying that I'm involved in something like that." "I'm not implying anything," Helen replied evenly. "But I do think you know more than you're letting on." Harper chuckled softly, shaking his head. "You know, I've heard rumors about these sorts of things before. People love to gossip, especially when it comes to someone like me. But I assure you, Judge, I have no involvement in anything of the sort. I'm just a businessman. I make money. I give back to the community. And that's all there is to it." Helen leaned forward, lowering her voice. "You're lying, John. I've seen the photos. I know you've been in contact with Mark Thompson. I know you've been involved with some very dangerous people. And I think you know exactly what happened to my daughter." Harper's smile faltered for the first time, and his eyes darkened. "Your daughter?" he repeated slowly. "I'm sorry, I don't follow." "Emily Carter," Helen said, her voice tight with barely controlled anger. "She disappeared 12 years ago. I believe she was taken by the same people you're working with, and I think you know what happened to her." For a long moment, Harper said nothing. He simply stared at Helen, his eyes cold and calculating. Then, slowly, he leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "Judge Carter," he said quietly, "I think you've let your emotions cloud your judgment. I understand the pain of losing a loved one. I truly do. But you're barking up the wrong tree. I had nothing to do with your daughter's disappearance." Helen's hands clenched into fists under the table. She could feel the anger rising in her chest, but she forced herself to remain calm. "You're lying," she said again, her voice steady. "I know you're involved. I know about the trafficking ring, and I know you've been using your business as a front for illegal activity. You can deny it all you want, but I'm going to find the proof." Harper's eyes narrowed, and for the first time, Helen saw the mask slip. His charming demeanor was gone, replaced by something darker, more menacing. "You're playing a dangerous game, Judge," he said softly. "I would advise you to stop before you get hurt." Helen met his gaze, refusing to back down. "I'm not afraid of you, John." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The tension between them was palpable, like a coiled spring ready to snap. Then, without another word, Harper stood up, smoothing the front of his suit. "I think this conversation is over," he said, his voice cold. "I suggest you focus on your work, Judge, and leave this matter alone. For your own sake." Helen watched as he turned and walked out of the cafe, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew she had just crossed a line. She had pushed Harper, and now he knew she was onto him. But she couldn't stop now. Harper was hiding something. Something big, and she was going to uncover it, no matter the cost. As Helen sat there, her mind racing, her phone buzzed in her pocket. It was a message from Sam. "We've got something. Meet me at the station." Helen stood up, tossing a few bills on the table as she hurried out of the cafe. She didn't know what Sam had found, but she had a feeling it was important. As she drove to the station, her mind kept replaying her conversation with Harper. He had threatened her, but there was something else in his words, something that hinted at a deeper connection to Emily's disappearance, Harper wasn't just involved in the trafficking ring. He knew more about what had happened to her daughter, and that realization only strengthened her resolve. When she arrived at the station, Sam was waiting for her in his office, his expression grave. "We've been digging deeper into Harper's finances," he said without preamble. "And we found something. He's been making large, undocumented payments to offshore accounts. Payments that coincide with the time Emily went missing." Helen's heart skipped a beat. Offshore accounts. Where? "Mostly in Eastern Europe," Sam said. "But there's more. We also found evidence that Harper has been in contact with several known traffickers in the region. He's been funding their operations, using his businesses as a front." Helen felt a surge of anger and disbelief. "So it's true," she whispered. "Harper's been behind this all along." Sam nodded grimly. "It looks that way. But we still don't have enough to bring him in. We need more evidence, something concrete that ties him directly to the trafficking." The revelation hit Helen like a ton of bricks. John Harper, one of the most respected men in Maplewood, the same man who had been praised for his charitable work and his supposed contributions to the community, was in fact deeply involved in a human trafficking ring. And now, there was evidence that he had been funding these operations for years, using his businesses as a cover. But the most disturbing realization was that he might be connected to Emily's disappearance. All those years Helen had spent wondering, grieving, and hoping had now been transformed into a burning need for justice. But as Sam had said, they still didn't have enough. The offshore accounts and payments were incriminating, but they weren't enough to directly tie Harper to the trafficking ring or to Emily. They needed more, something that would force Harper into a corner, something that would expose his role in the entire operation. Helen left the police station that night with a whirlwind of emotions swirling inside her: anger, frustration, sorrow, but most of all, a grim determination to see this through. She couldn't sleep, her mind racing with questions and strategies. What else could they do to uncover the full truth? Who else might be involved? Could Emily still be alive somewhere, caught in this horrific web? The next morning, Helen made a decision. She couldn't wait for the slow wheels of justice to turn. She had to take matters into her own hands. She knew it was dangerous, but her instincts told her that Harper was on edge after their meeting, and that might be their best chance to catch him off guard. She called Sam early that day, telling him her plan. "We need to get inside Harper's network," she said. "We need to find someone who can give us direct evidence of his involvement. He's been paying off people for years, and someone has to know where the bodies are buried, figuratively or literally." Sam was hesitant. "Helen, this is risky. Harper's not some low-level criminal we can pressure easily. If we go after him too aggressively without solid evidence, he'll lawyer up, and we'll lose any chance of bringing him down." "I know the risks," Helen replied, her voice firm. "But I'm done waiting. We have to make a move before he covers his tracks. I don't care what it takes. I'm going to find out what happened to Emily, and if Harper is involved, he's not going to get away with it." Reluctantly, Sam agreed to help. They devised a plan to track Harper's movements and contacts. Sam pulled in a few favors from his old contacts in law enforcement, bringing in a discreet team to start surveillance on Harper's businesses and known associates. They needed to find someone who could provide inside information, someone who had worked with Harper or had knowledge of the trafficking ring. For days, Helen and Sam worked around the clock, gathering intelligence, following leads, and piecing together a picture of Harper's operations. The deeper they dug, the more they uncovered. Harper had built a vast network, one that extended far beyond Maplewood. His reach stretched into cities across the country and even internationally. His legitimate business dealings were only a front, a way to launder the money flowing in from his illegal activities. And Mark Thompson, despite his low-level criminal history, had been a small cog in Harper's larger machine. It was becoming clear that Mark had likely been involved in transporting people, possibly even helping to move victims of the trafficking ring, though whether he had direct knowledge of Emily's fate remained uncertain. The tension was mounting. Helen felt like they were close, but something was still missing. They needed a break, a piece of information that would tie everything together and give them the evidence they needed to bring Harper down. One evening, as Helen was driving home from a long day of working with Sam, her phone buzzed. It was a text message from an unknown number. "I know where your daughter is. Meet me at the docks. Midnight. Come alone." Helen's heart skipped a beat. The docks. Who was this, and how did they know about Emily? Her mind raced, trying to piece together what this could mean. Was it a trap, or was it the break she had been waiting for? She knew she should call Sam, let him know what was happening, but something inside her told her this was a moment she needed to face alone. Whoever had sent the message might be scared, might be willing to talk only if she came without backup. If this was her only chance to find out what had happened to Emily, she couldn't risk losing it. Against her better judgment, Helen decided to go. She grabbed her coat and left her house, her nerves buzzing with anticipation and fear. The docks were an industrial area on the outskirts of town, a place known for shady dealings and late-night activity. It was the perfect spot for someone looking to make a secret exchange. As Helen arrived at the docks, the moon cast long shadows over the deserted area. The air was cold and heavy with the smell of salt water and rusting metal. She parked her car a short distance away and walked cautiously toward the meeting point, a dimly lit pier jutting out into the water. Her heart pounded in her chest, her senses on high alert. She reached the end of the pier, her eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. For a few moments, there was nothing, just the sound of the water lapping against the wooden posts. Then, out of the shadows, a figure emerged. It was a man, tall and lean, wearing a hooded jacket. His face was obscured by the shadows, but as he stepped closer, Helen recognized him. It was Mark Thompson. "You?" Helen's voice trembled with disbelief. "You sent the message." Mark nodded, his expression tense. "Yeah, I figured it was time we talked. No more games." Helen's mind raced. What was going on? Why had Mark reached out to her like this? "What do you know about my daughter?" she demanded, her voice shaking with anger and desperation. "Tell me where she is." Mark hesitated, looking down at the ground for a moment before meeting her eyes. "I don't know where she is. Not exactly. But I know what happened to her, and I know who's responsible." Helen's heart felt like it had stopped. "Who?" "Harper," Mark said quietly, his voice laced with fear. "He's been running this trafficking ring for years. He's got people all over, cops, politicians, businessmen. They're all in on it. But your daughter, Emily, she was different. She was taken because she was a threat to someone in Harper's circle. I don't know the details, but I heard them talking about her. They said she knew something. That's why they took her." Helen's mind reeled. "Emily, a threat? How? What are you talking about?" she demanded. "What did she know?" "I don't know," Mark replied, shaking his head. "But whatever it was, it scared them. They couldn't let her go. That's why she disappeared." Helen's legs felt weak beneath her. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. Emily hadn't just been a victim of random violence or trafficking. She had been targeted because she had known something dangerous, something that could expose Harper's entire operation. Tears welled in Helen's eyes as she took a step toward Mark. "Please," she begged, her voice cracking. "Tell me where she is. Is she still alive?" Mark's face softened, a look of deep regret crossing his features. "I don't know. I swear, I don't. But I heard Harper's men talking. They said she was moved out of the country, somewhere in Eastern Europe. They kept her hidden because they didn't want her to talk." Helen's breath caught in her throat. Eastern Europe, the offshore accounts, the payments. It all made sense now. Emily had been taken out of the country, far beyond Maplewood, beyond the reach of local law enforcement. "I'm sorry," Mark said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I wish I could give you more, but that's all I know." Helen felt her world crumbling around her. For years, she had held on to hope that Emily was alive, that somehow she would come home. And now, the truth was staring her in the face. Her daughter had been caught in the crosshairs of a criminal empire, taken far away, and possibly lost forever. But even in the midst of her despair, Helen felt a spark of determination. This wasn't over. She wasn't going to let Harper get away with this. She was going to bring him down, no matter what it took. And if Emily was still out there, Helen was going to find her. As she turned to leave the docks, her heart heavy with grief and resolve, she knew that the fight for justice was just beginning. Helen left the docks with her heart pounding, the weight of everything she had learned pressing down on her. The night air was cool, but her skin burned with a mixture of anger, fear, and fierce determination. Mark's words echoed in her mind. Emily had been taken because she knew something dangerous. The idea that her daughter had been targeted, not just as a random victim of human trafficking, but because she had been seen as a threat, made Helen's blood boil. How had her sweet, innocent Emily gotten tangled up in something so dark, so evil? She drove home in silence, her hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. The town of Maplewood, which once felt like a safe haven, now felt like a dark labyrinth of secrets and lies. John Harper was at the center of it all, pulling the strings of a criminal empire that extended far beyond this sleepy little town. He had money, power, and connections, everything he needed to stay untouchable. But now, Helen had something Harper didn't expect. She had the truth, and she had no intention of letting him slip through her fingers. The next morning, Helen met with Sam in his office. He could see the exhaustion in her eyes, the lines of stress etched into her face. But there was something else too, something fiery and unyielding. "We need to move now," Helen said, her voice low but firm. "Mark gave us the lead we've been waiting for. Harper's been running this operation for years, but Emily, she was targeted because she knew something that threatened him. That's why they took her. They'd moved her out of the country, probably to Eastern Europe. If we can prove that, we can finally bring him down." Sam leaned forward, the concern clear in his eyes. "Helen, I'm with you. But you have to understand, this is bigger than we thought. Harper's been covering his tracks for years. We got offshore accounts, suspicious transactions, but that's not enough. We need something concrete, something that ties him directly to Emily's disappearance. Without that, all we have are suspicions." Helen nodded, though the frustration gnawed at her insides. She knew Sam was right. They needed hard evidence. But how could they get it? Harper was careful, too careful. He had insulated himself with layers of protection. Shell companies, paid-off officials, and men like Mark who did his dirty work without knowing the full scope of what they were involved in. As the two of them sat in the quiet office, a plan began to take shape in Helen's mind. It was dangerous, and it would require her to step far beyond the boundaries of her role as a judge. But she had crossed lines already. This was no longer about her career. This was about Emily. If Harper had anything to do with her daughter's disappearance, then he needed to pay. "I have an idea," Helen said slowly, her mind racing ahead of her words. "We need to catch Harper off guard. We know he's been laundering money through his businesses, and we know he's connected to the trafficking ring. But he doesn't know how much we know. If we can push him, make him feel threatened, he might slip up." Sam frowned. "What are you suggesting?" "We need someone on the inside," Helen replied, her eyes sharp. "Someone who can get close to him, gain his trust, and gather the evidence we need. Mark is our only link to Harper's network. He's already afraid, and he's clearly desperate. We can use that to our advantage." Sam stared at her for a long moment, clearly uneasy. "You're talking about using Mark as a mole." "Helen, that's risky. Harper will have eyes on him. If he even suspects Mark's working with us, it could get him killed." "I know the risks," Helen said, her voice steady. "But it's the only chance we've got. Harper trusts Mark, or at least he thinks he does. If we can convince Mark to cooperate, to feed Harper the information we want him to hear, We might be able to expose something Harper doesn't want us to find." Sam hesitated, rubbing his temples as he considered her proposal. "And what if Mark refuses? What if he's too scared to go through with it?" "He won't refuse," Helen said with quiet certainty. "Not if I talk to him. He knows what's at stake." Later that day, Helen arranged a meeting with Mark at the county jail. She had pulled strings to have him transferred to a more secure location, out of Harper's reach. When she entered the small windowless room where Mark was waiting, she could see the fear etched into his face. His once defiant demeanor had crumbled, replaced by the haunted look of a man who had seen too much and lived to regret it. "Judge Carter," Mark said, his voice shaky. "Why are you here? I already told you everything I know." Helen sat down across from him, her eyes locked on his. "I need your help, Mark. I need you to do something for me. Something dangerous, but necessary. You want out of this mess, don't you? You want to stop looking over your shoulder for the rest of your life." Mark swallowed hard, his eyes darting nervously around the room. "I don't know, Judge. I've done a lot of bad things, but going up against Harper, that's suicide. He's got people everywhere. You don't just walk away from him." "You don't have to walk away," Helen said, her voice calm but forceful. "You just need to walk toward him. You know Harper better than anyone. You've been a part of his network for years. He trusts you, even if he doesn't respect you. We need you to use that trust, to feed him information that will make him slip. We need you to expose him." Mark's hands fidgeted on the table, his nerves palpable. "What kind of information?" Helen leaned forward, her voice lowering. "Harper's paranoid. He's always looking over his shoulder, wondering who's going to betray him. If we make him think there's a leak in his operation, that someone's giving us information, he'll start to panic. And when people like Harper panic, they make mistakes." Mark stared at her, his eyes wide. "And what happens when he figures out I'm the leak?" "He won't," Helen replied firmly. "We'll protect you. But you have to trust us. This is your chance to make things right, to help take down the man who's been pulling the strings all along. You want out of this life, don't you?" Mark hesitated, his mind clearly torn between fear and the desire for redemption. After what felt like an eternity, he nodded slowly. "All right. I'll do it. But you have to promise me I get protection. Witness protection. A new life. Everything." "You'll get everything," Helen assured him. "But we need results, Mark. We need something that will take Harper down." With Mark's reluctant agreement, the plan was set into motion. Over the next few days, Sam and his team worked tirelessly to stage the leak. They carefully planted false information through Mark, feeding it directly to Harper's inner circle. The goal was simple: make Harper believe that his empire was unraveling from the inside, that someone was betraying him. It didn't take long for Harper to react. As predicted, the paranoia set in. Harper's usually cool demeanor cracked as he began to lash out, questioning his closest associates, pulling strings to clean up any loose ends. But in his frantic attempt to control the situation, Harper made a critical mistake. He reached out to one of his offshore contacts, arranging for a large sum of money to be moved to a hidden account. It was the exact proof Sam and Helen needed to tie him directly to the trafficking ring. With the evidence in hand, Sam's team prepared to move in. They had gathered enough to arrest Harper on charges of money laundering, conspiracy, and human trafficking. The case was airtight, but there was still one unanswered question burning in Helen's mind. Where was Emily? On the night of the raid, Helen stood outside Harper's mansion, her heart pounding as the police swarmed the property. Harper was taken into custody without a fight, his once powerful empire crumbling around him. As the officers led him away in handcuffs, Helen felt a momentary surge of satisfaction. Justice had been served, or at least part of it. But the victory was bittersweet. Harper had been taken down, but there was still no word on Emily's whereabouts. She could be anywhere, in Eastern Europe, or worse, dead. Helen had hoped that by bringing Harper to justice, she would get answers. But as the days passed, The trail grew cold once again. Months later, as Harper sat in jail awaiting trial, Helen received a letter. It was unsigned, but the message was clear. She's alive. Keep looking. Tears welled in Helen's eyes as she clutched the letter in her hands. Emily was out there somewhere. And now, more than ever, Helen was determined to find her.